right, welcome everyone to Change 2020. This is our second event. As you know, COVID has hit us very hard this year, and we moved this event to an online forum. This is our second event, and we're looking into driving systems change. So first off, a massive thank you from Social Marketing at Griffith, and also a massive thank you from myself and the co-chairs, myself and Jaywan, for coming to this event. It is greatly appreciated. But before we begin today, just a little bit of housekeeping. Could I please ask if you can mute your microphones and just so we avoid any background noise. Also, if you haven't already, make sure your video is off as well, because we want to make sure we have the best possible stream with it, just based on all the different connections we have coming in today. Also, today's event will be shared and recorded after it's finished. So you'll see this on YouTube later on tonight, or depending on where you're streaming from the world, your morning. First off, before we begin, I just want to do an acknowledgement of the country. Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, and pay respects to the elders, past, present, and extend all respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Social Marketing at Griffith. So before we begin, let's quickly talk about our centre. We're the largest university social marketing research centre. We have a lot of great research projects. We're very practical. We also bring in academia quite strongly into that, being a university as well. And there's a lot of people who've gone into actually working together to make this event happen. Traditionally, in the last 2 years, it's been 160 people coming to Brisbane. So it's great to see that we have a lot of international participants coming in this year from various number of countries. I've looked at the attendees list, so it's exciting to have this sent across. And yeah, so again, very warm welcome. So today we're going to be talking about driving systems change. And we've got 3 industry leaders to talk about systems and systems thinking. We have Dr. Christine Donegan, lecturer from National University of Ireland. Which we should be talking about hacking provisional systems as well, and a little more of that sort of overarching of what is actual systems thinking, systems theory. We're also going to be hearing from Professor Mira Sithi, who is director of USC's Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre, and we'll be talking about 3 ways to hack the system. And we've also got our own Professor Sharyn Runderfield, who's the founding director of Social Marketing at Griffith. And we're talking about the practical aspects of systems and how that all affects into what we do as change practitioners every day. With saying that, I'm going to pass over to my first speaker, which is Dr. Christine Donegan.
Hello, Alex. Thank you very much. Hello, you're very welcome to this introductory session of Driving Systems Change called Listen, Learn and Leverage. And in the Irish tradition, I'd like to extend Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes, as we look at provisioning systems and how we can change the patterns of our daily life. So let's start with an iconic picture. This is a picture of planet Earth taken in 1968 in December, where humanity for the first time saw the planet we were living on. It's a small planet in a vast universe. It has plenty of liquid water and food supply for us humans to survive. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It's just right. It's our Goldilocks planet. Importantly, with our Goldilocks planet, we as a species have evolved. This is essential both to our survival and also to how we have thrived over the years. Most people, when we think about evolution, think about it over a vast time scale. But in fact, a researcher, Dr. Tegan Lucas from Flanders University, has shown how the evolution of human species has accelerated in the last 250 years. Modern day children are being born without wisdom teeth. They have slightly smaller faces, more bones in their leg, and some being born today have a 3rd artery in the forearm. The point here, the takeaway message, is that you and I evolve with our Goldilocks planet. Our Goldilocks planet shapes us and our behaviors, and we too shape our Goldilocks planet. This is important because you and I are part of a large, highly connected ecosystem of living things. We change the planet, but the planet, importantly, changes us as well. And if ever we needed a lesson in this, it has to be the pandemic. The pandemic is showing us humans how interconnected we are, from local to global. We take our health system and it has severely disrupted our transport system, our food systems, our educational systems, our learning systems. At the junction of this is this huge understanding that we have reached a new point in time where the interconnections are so strong that they are affecting everybody around the globe. So, a question for you. Are you in a situation, are you working to bring about big change, but are you disappointed? Are you disappointed with the results that you're getting and the amount of change, the degree of change? Okay, so let's see. So 75% of you are saying, yes, you're looking for big change, but you're not happy. You're not getting it. Something is blocking that change. And in many situations, what we're finding now, and you'll hear from Maria, that there are lots of people who can explain why we're not seeing the change we're desiring to bring about to co-create. So we need to approach many of the complex, wicked, sustainable problems that we're facing in our daily lives and our daily work. We need to change ourselves, and we need to change the systems that we are living and working in. The first change has to be about the way we approach these problems. We can go to Nigel Franks, who's a famous ant researcher, for some insights. He has spent years looking at the behavior of ants. And when you look at a single ant, their behavior is very simple and straightforward. In fact, if you put a single ant on the table, the ant can spend hours and hours going around in circles until they die of exhaustion. But something quite unique happens when you put quite a large number of ants together. When you put them together, the collective insight shows us a lot more complexity beyond the simple behavior of the individual ant. All of a sudden, without any central organization, the ants seem to organize themselves where they can work together. They can find food, they can, through chemical secretions, communicate with other ants. They can plan and organize themselves to get there and bring the food back to home base. So collectively, the ant's survival is dependent on cooperation and communication with each other. This has very important lessons for us because it shows us that when we're looking for change, we need to go beyond the individual. We need to go beyond the micro level. And we need to look at the collective patterns that are occurring in our societies, in our communities, in our localities. This shift in decision making is a shift from linear to nonlinear thinking. And Kim explains this in a nice mathematical way. When we look at individuals, we know an awful lot about consumers and consumer buyer behavior. We've got a lot of detail there about the complexity. This takes very much the A, B, C route. If A, then B, then C. But when we move to a collective perspective, when we look at the interactions that are happening among consumers, wholesalers, retailers, we start to find that there's a lot more complexity at work. So if A, then B, then C. But wait a minute, C is influencing A. So there's a feedback mechanism at work. And then it gets even more complex because D is influencing C, which is influencing B. So all of a sudden, it gets more unpredictable. All of a sudden, there's more complexity there. And our decision making to achieve big change needs to factor this in. We need to move from looking at the parts of a system to understanding how the different components, how the different stakeholders, how the different organizations, how the policymakers are connected to communities, and how communities are connected to you and I in our daily life. We need to move beyond seeing change as an event targeting a particular group of people that has a beginning, middle, and end, that has a campaign or an intervention, as if it's a once-off factor. Remember Goldilocks and our constant evolution. There is constant change happening in our relationships, in our interconnections, in how we behave. So we need to look at behavioral change and systems change as a process that involves listening and learning on a constant basis over time, and not an A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, stop. We also need, as the ants tell us, to think about the individual and how they connect to the collective. So when we look at systems, we talk about systems being nested or embedded in each other. So we see schools as a system, and they're embedded in the educational system. And the educational system is embedded in a higher level educational system, including perhaps third level education and vocational training. This is a significant shift away for many people from what a lot of experts would view as splat. Alan Tapp uses this term. It's a lovely term to describe some leaflets, posters, ads, and things. We can't simplify change by messaging. We're seeing a lot of this in the pandemic. We certainly need messaging, but it's not the only variable, factor, or force that will get us through systems change. So adopting a systems mindset, awakening to systems thinking, becoming conscious of a system, means you see the interrelationships between consumers, retailers, nonprofit organizations, media, scientists, etc. And these interrelationships allow you to see patterns of change rather than a snapshot of change. So we've mentioned the word system. When we're looking at humans, we're not talking specifically about solar systems and other type of biological systems that other scientists use. When we're looking for systems change and humans, we're talking about provisioning systems. Provisioning systems are social systems because you and I are social animals. And when we move to the collective level, collective trust becomes very important. And this trust is developed through networks and assemblies of stakeholders, micro, meso, and macro level stakeholders. And the purpose of our provisioning systems is to bring about exchange so that we meet the needs and wants that you and I have for food, for entertainment, for security, for warmth, for clothes, and the list goes on. To dig into provisioning systems a little bit more, we can broadly say, and picking up on this nested idea, we can say that there are 4 types of systems that make up an overall provisioning system. We have a prescriptive exchange system. We associate these with defense, with health, with education. We have marketing provisioning systems. Marketing provisioning systems offer you and I, not everybody, they offer choice and assortments based on our economic abilities. We also have collaborative systems. We would tend to think of these as non-profit organizations, perhaps public sector, to some extent, social enterprises. And always from that nested perspective, when you're looking at the interrelationships of people, there are informal exchange systems. These are the seeds of new exchange opportunities that might emerge. It's also the darker side of provisioning systems as well. Okay, question for you. What kind of system are you working in at the moment? So your second poll is coming up. Are you currently in a prescriptive exchange system? Perhaps you see yourself working in a marketing exchange system. Maybe you're a non-profit organization. Therefore, you're the collaborative exchange system. Or perhaps it's an informal exchange system. Maybe you don't see yourself working in any of these. And perhaps you're not sure. Take a minute now to cast your vote. Okay, so very interesting. So a lot of you are in the collaborative exchange. You're coming from the non-profit social enterprise. We also have some commercial partners here as well in the marketing exchange. And we have some public sector too. But there's quite a lot of you still not sure. We'll close the poll there. The reality is that you may perceive yourself to be in one part of a provisioning system. So you may be working for a commercial marketing company, or you may be working for a charity, and it's easy to identify. But because of the interrelationships, because of the evolution that we're now seeing in our provisioning systems, as exemplified by the pandemic, the reality is that if something happens in a prescriptive exchange system that is disruptive enough, it could have dramatic implications for the change work that you're trying to do, and you're based in the collaborative system. So you need to be aware of how your system is nested relative to the other systems. And why is this? Because of the feedback mechanism. So here's your next tip. A really powerful listening tool for system change, regardless of whether you're a commercial company, public sector, or non-profit organization, is a technique we call causal loop diagrams. Causal loop diagrams are prime tools when you want to capture the interrelationships that are happening between the forces at work in your system and the embedded nested systems as well. So effectively we say, if A increases, it will bring about an increase in B, and an increase in B will bring about an increase in A. So if we increase people's awareness, that awareness may lead to an increase in motivation as well. And sometimes, of course, it works the opposite way. Sometimes if you increase a variable, so if you increase, for example, a tax, you might find that you don't get an increase in the compliance behavior that you're interested in. In fact, you could get the opposite. So we can use these powerful causal loop diagrams to help us get an insight into systems. We can look at causal loops that are based on the barriers that are currently at work in a system, And we can look at causal loops that are looking at the enabling forces or the facilitating forces. These might be the bright spots in the system. And we can focus our barrier and enabler causal loop work on the structures and the behaviors in our provisioning systems, which gives us a very deep listening ability to the system. So let's stop there for our third and final poll. Thinking about the change that you're looking for, are you currently focusing on structural barriers or enablers or structural issues? Are you focusing more on behaviors that you're seeing? Are you focusing on both? Perhaps none of these? And perhaps this is your first time to systems change, so you're not yet doing this kind of work. So let's get a sense and see how this is working for you. Okay, so some people are focusing on structure, some are focusing on behavior, and quite a lot are focusing on both. Well, good news all around. If you're focusing on structure, behavior, both, you're certainly going to be making a lot more progress than not looking at these factors. We now know that behaviors are probably in most cases more important than structure. Why? Because as humans, we create the structures. We design the structures of our provisioning systems. We design the delivery mechanisms, the products, the services. We design the customer training, the staff training. We design the complaint mechanisms. We design the tools that we choose to listen to the system with as well. So it's very important when you want big change to learn about the dynamics. And here's an example from a flu vaccination study that we did here in the west of Ireland. The European flu vaccination rate was set at 70%. When this study was done, the national target was 40%. And when we started with the study, the flu vaccination rate among nurses was at 8%. So we looked at the structures, and yes, we found that the delivery of flu vaccination could have been improved. We could have opened the occupational health office for longer hours, but it didn't explain why the rate was so low. So we went to the nurses and we looked at their behaviors. Instead of treating nurses as one homogeneous group, we know behaviors differ according to people. So we looked at the nurses and their different behaviors. And you find in many systems that there will always be 3 types of behaviors in a provisioning system. There'll be the group and network that are exemplifying the behavior you're interested in this case, are green nurses. There'll be a group that aren't engaging in the behavior, but they're interested. They just need a bit of help to get over the line. These are our orange nurses. And you will inevitably, when you're looking for change and the system isn't working exactly the way you want it, you will find a network or a group or a segment or a subpopulation that are not exhibiting the behaviors. And when we analyzed and listened to these 3 different groups, we found that the nurses who did not engage in flu vaccination had far more restricted communication, cooperation, networks at work, compared to the nurses who were getting the flu vaccine. And their communication mechanisms, delivery mechanisms, their cooperation mechanisms were far more extensive than the group of nurses who were not going for this. So combine your causal loop listening, combine your behavioral dynamics, and you can put all of the different loops together to get what we call a systems map. Alex, I might ask you for the next slide. So here is what a systems map looks like when you put your individual causal loops together. And here's your next tip. the behavioral dynamics will be driving the system. We see these circled here in red, and they tend to be at the center of a systems map. Here we find that fit and healthy beliefs and past experiences explained the differences in the behaviors that we were seeing between the nurses who got the flu vaccine and the nurses who did not. The nurses who got the flu vaccine believed their fit and healthy beliefs meant that they saw the flu vaccine boosting their immune system. The nurses who did not get the flu vaccine, their fit and healthy beliefs meant that they believed the vaccine was going to harm their system. So using causal loop diagrams and understanding the behaviors of different networks means that you can grapple with the messiness and the complexity of the behaviors at work. And it's not to say that you avoid or don't pay attention to the structural issues. As you see here in the small circle, we have access, which is delivery, which is our distribution channels. And it's there, but it's not the dominant dynamic. So if I've got very little money and very little resources, I'm going to get more change for my time and my effort if I focus on the dominant dynamics. And here's another example again. This is taken from COVID-19 and looking at people's blue and green space usage. So looking at recreation and leisure. And again, you find the same theme coming through. On our left-hand side, we have people who were disadvantaged and didn't have access to parks. And on our right-hand side, we see other groups, behavioral dynamics, where there was huge social cohesion occurring. So to summarize, if you want to get involved in systems change work, and all of us here are recommending you do, if you want big change, listen, learn, and leverage. Like Goldilocks, you have come to provisioning systems change, not too early, not too late, but just at the right time for you. And with that, I will wish you Guramila Mahagat, which is 1,000 thank yous. For more details on the flu study, or indeed on any of the mechanisms used in today's discussion, click on the hyperlink, or there's a book available for you as well. Back over to you, Alex.
Well, thank you, Christine. That was very insightful, and I love the Goldilocks analogy. Also, again, very sorry to everyone. It was my audio setup that was causing the delay. I'm not sure entirely what caused that, because it did not happen last night. So, again, great apologies. And Christine, that was a fantastic presentation. Now we are going to be having Maria speak, and she's going to talk about the 3 ways to hack the system. So over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much. And thanks for that great start to the night, Christine. It's a wonderful presentation. So hi, everybody. My name's Maria. I'm an Indigenous woman. I'm an Aboriginal woman. I'm of Kalkadoon, Thankwith and Bulgamon peoples. I'm also a professor of marketing here at the University of the Sunshine Coast. I was very thrilled this year. The beginning of this year marked the beginning of the opening of the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre that myself and my 2 wonderful colleagues, Catherine Manathunga and Jen Carter, have been working on for a number of years. So we're really thrilled with that opening. So I bring to you a lovely mix, I guess, this idea of understanding marketing and social marketing, but also bringing forward the perspectives of First Nations peoples. I also am thrilled to highlight that I'm an adjunct fellow with the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education. So look, I've worked on lots of different social marketing projects, but I think my main passion point has always been about widening participation in higher education. And I work with the National Centre for a number of years now, and have built quite a program of work focusing upon ways to not only increase access for people from disadvantaged backgrounds into higher education, but to ensure that they're successful in that path. And I think that's probably something that draws us all together here tonight, is that we're all focused on change. We're all focused on transformation. We love this idea that we can re-author our future, that we can change the scripts. And a lot of what we do around social marketing is that we have the power not only to help other people transform their lives, but to create intergenerational change. And I think that idea of changing the trajectory of not one person's, but their children and other family members is really exciting space to be in. So social marketing, as we know, is a disruptor, as Christine pointed out. It disrupts status quo thinking, feeling, and doing, the way we operate in the world. It gives us these opportunities one by one to address and change our personal scripts. But we know that when we're working downstream, we often do this in small scale. Systems change is about where we extend our line of sight beyond our original program participants to look at the invisible systems that sit around these, where a change in them can actually result in changes to power and privilege and other things that have an interplay with the position that our participants are in. So look, tonight I'm going to cover off a few hacks for you, and let's get started and have a look at some ways to hack the system. Now, we'll just foreground it that this is intentionally a little bit provocative, particularly in the second hack that I put forward. So it's not that I'm a meanie or anything like that. I've intentionally put that there because look, how are you going to change the world if you can't change yourself? And I think it's a really important thing because if we as social change agents want to challenge the system, in fact, we challenge the participants in our programs, then we should also challenge ourselves. So the whole idea of being a little bit provocative in places and sort of the whole point of it is to disrupt this politics of politeness. Sometimes we wear rose-colored glasses in the way we see the work that we do. It's also to bring things out of the shadows, to perhaps state things that have often been left unspoken. And the whole point of this is about transformation, after all. It's about to hopefully spark some awakenings so that at the end of this session, that you have some new insights, mostly into yourself, about the systems around us that create power, privilege, shackles, that create the wicked problems that we're set about to address. So to hack the system, you must first be aware of the system. So we often talk about the system, the ultimate matrix, this idea of driving a single systems change. But are we really only talking about one system? Is there only one? Or is there a multitude of grand algorithms? In fact, I think that there's an ecology of intersecting systems. And what they do is they tie us to the past, they tie us to each other, and they tie us to the environment around us. That's what they call the more than human spaces that we occupy. The way that we interact with each other, as Christine identified, is a part of the core of social marketing. But the way that we interact with our environment, the land, the air, the water, the seas, the environmental damage that we create, plus the environmental changes that we make that are steps in the right direction, can have a big impact. The cars we drive, the roads we build, the computers we use, and the internet and social media all form part of these interactive systems. They work together, they work with each other, and they create these grand algorithms that create a script for our lives, which is often not visible to the naked eye. So COVID-19, it's been the biggest systems disruptor across multiple systems that we've seen in a century. It changed the way we worked. It changes how our children are taught and how they learned. It made us realize things we took for granted, such as the company of others, entertainment, leisure, the supply chain, and just that food security. Now, I'm all sure that you all had one point ended up in the supermarket and only to realize that there are empty shelves around you, or to be surprised to see a security guard standing around the toilet paper supply. Yet here we are 6 months after those initial lockdowns here in Australia anyway. And what happened? At the beginning of those lockdowns, we romanticized this idea of that we're all in this together. But what we also did was the system revealed itself to us. We saw how systems, such as our supply chain systems, how we interact, our community systems, actually existed. We hadn't seen them before. We didn't know that they were fragile until COVID demonstrated that they were. At the end of lockdown here in Australia, or here in Queensland anyway, the Black Lives Matters movement brought our attention to a cluster of systems that have been a part, that were never, I guess, a part of the collective consciousness. BLM revealed to lots of people the impacts of colonisation, the impacts and lives that people of colour experience. But here we are in Australia towards this 6-month window, and what we start to see is the sheer muscle memory of these grander logarithms forming again. We talk about the new normal, but there's lots of elements of the old normal still there. Many people have put their bikes in the shed and are back in their cars. And in fact, the federal government's recent budget demonstrates that they've used the same old normal levers, such as tax cuts, consumerism, a focus on primary industries such as gas and mining, to encourage spending, to get us back working, to return it to business as usual in order to restart the economy. And through these policies and these levers, it seems that it's just restarting the old normal. It's retaining the strength of the original logarithms. So COVID-19 revealed for many of us that there are systems around us that are hidden in the shadows. BLM was a transformative experience for many people, people of colour and others. It woke us. For many people, it woke us not only to the power and privilege that's around us, but to these invisible systems that exist in the shadows that actually shape our lives. They shape what we think, what we feel, what they do, and they are sometimes determined from the nature of our birth, our gender, our race, or poverty if we're born into it. The systems reveal themselves when we're ready to see them. So I sort of write this from a personal experience. I think sometimes as we get older and we start to see systems around us that we never knew, we see this glitch. I mean, BLM brought into the public consciousness something that's already been there. But for some of you, you may realize that as we become older, we start to see the impacts of these systems. A lot of the times we talk about systems and we have some lived experience of some systems, but it's unconscious to us what's going on around us. So when the system reveals itself, we start to realize too that we are encoded into the system, that we almost have this Pavlovian response. You know, think about it. We just got tax cuts here in Australia, so the first thing we think about is spending. So almost like Pavlov's dog, the bell rings and we salivate. So these are all elements of the system around us in our everyday life that we might not always be conscious about. But once you see the system, you can't unsee it, so to speak. And sometimes systems are hidden in the obvious. Now, I'll give you 2 examples here. One is the English language conventions. Now, we all write reports and we all write up about our programs and what we're looking at. But have you ever noticed that English language conventions have an inherent hierarchy within them? We're told when we write these reports that we should write in active voice. An active voice is, by definition, where an action is done by a subject to another or to an object. So it inherently defines a hierarchical relationship where something exerts influence over something else. This may be why when we talk and write about social marketing, why we find it hard to articulate and to explain the intricacies of what we're dealing with, simply because our language conventions don't allow us to. One other thing too is that when we talk in social marketing, we present our frameworks and our models, as Christine has shown a few there, we have to present these in a 2-dimensional form. We can't show the complexity, the richness, the deepness, and you never feel fully satisfied after you've put together some sort of a diagram or image or framework about the phenomena you're looking at. So this simply is because we're limited to 2-dimensional ways of communication. So as you can see here, our language convention, when it's combined with 2-dimensional images and frameworks, inhibits our ability to confer or communicate the depth and richness of the systems that we're talking about or the phenomena that we're investigating. So this may in fact be part of the reason why we struggle with wicked problems. The second hack to the system is that you must realize that you're actually part of the system. Now, this might be a bit of an uncomfortable topic for some people, and some of you may not have even thought about it. So while we see ourselves, and you see yourself as an agent of change, as someone benevolent who's making a difference in people's lives, you have to also consider the shadow side. You have to consider that perhaps to some of your participants in your programs, You are the system. Not that you're the fighter against the system, but in fact that you are the system. It's important at this point to understand that if you're going to push back on the system or systems, you have to acknowledge you are complicit in them as well. And it's sort of this uncomfortable balance that we have to square up. While we go about making positive changes in the lives of others, or perhaps in our professional lives, on other levels, such as our personal lives, we may be complicit in the system. We may have food waste, we may have unhealthy eating, we may engage in and enjoy things like fast fashion. And I think we have to square these things up as social marketers through what's called reflexivity or reflective practice. We have to come to terms that the human experience is often one of contradictions and paradoxes. That on one hand, while we help and challenge the system, on another hand, we are complicit in the system or submissive to the system itself. So while we may on the surface see that or believe or frame ourselves as being agents of change, others may see us as agents of the system. What I'd encourage people to do, and I actually have this as a challenge for you, is to unbracket yourself. So reflexivity or reflecting on your role in the system is important. You can't be idealistic and say, well, I'm going to live by these ideal values. In fact, what happens is that, as I said, the human experience is a mix of paradoxes. It's a bit of a hot mess, really, when you think about it. And as a result of that, we often live these contradictory lives. So reflexivity is coming to terms with this, is acknowledging that what your motivations are may be manifest and may be socially acceptable, but to consider those latent motivations that sit underneath, or the dark side of the motivations that you have when you try to transform the lives of others. In particular, many social marketers that herald from business schools do this thing called bracketing. They bracket themselves. What that means is they see themselves as bystanders or observers to a social problem rather than participants in it. That's because they have a post-positivist philosophy rather than seeing themselves from a constructivist point of view. So what this means that social marketers sometimes put themselves at arm's length to the program that they've developed or the intervention that they're a part of. They bracket themselves. They take themselves out of the system, out of the equation. And by doing that, what they don't do is they don't acknowledge how their position and privilege has not only shaped the intervention, but how it has affected their view and assumptions that sit underneath the programs that they've developed. For those of you who've come from health backgrounds or from other social science backgrounds, you're often aware of this notion of bracketing. But for those particularly from business backgrounds, it's not something that we regularly do. So it's important that with unbracketing yourself is that you notice and acknowledge your position and privilege and your assumptions, and you're brutally honest with where you sit with the phenomena. Now, a part of this is also about positioning yourself in the system. After all, you're part of it. So positioning yourself means that you are not only aware of the privilege and power that you have or don't have and where you sit amongst others, but it's important that you and your stakeholders or those on your project team are aware of it too. So I'll give you an example with positioning yourself in Aboriginal cultures, as I'm sure you've all observed. In Aboriginal cultures, people will introduce themselves by the name of the language groups from which they descend or are a part of. They will often talk about their traditional country and their links to the land. We often talk about our personal histories and stories, our challenges, and how we've suffered through adversity, but then thrived at the other end of it. These personal stories and narratives are important. They're not just there to share. They're something that Indigenous peoples do, but the reason they're there is to help you to locate people in space and place and amongst their people and communities. Social marketers should also consider this type of positioning. Positioning when they're amongst their team, to be aware of where everyone is coming from, what their histories are, motivations are, and what has brought them together to work on this particular project itself. So I challenge you to unbracket yourself and to ask yourself some tough questions. As good old Stan Walker says, how are you going to change the world if you can't change yourself? So I'll ask you some questions. I'll leave you to ponder them. You're welcome to pop your answers into the chat box if you wish to share as well. Why are you involved in social change? Not just the socially acceptable answer, but be brutally honest with yourself. What motivates you? What brought you to this space? Is it benevolence and hope? Or is it a deep-seated insecurity? Do you have a superiority complex? Do you want to be seen as noble by others? I told you to be a little bit provocative. Another tough question to ask yourself is, have you ever pondered if you're building a career on the misfortunes of others? And how do you square that up with yourself? Are you really a true believer in the cause that you're working for and with? And if you move from cause to cause, why is this? Why don't you build a program around a single cause where your passion lies? Are you trying to right a wrong? Was an injustice done to you in the past, and that you're focusing now on trying to make changes so that others don't experience the same thing that you did? Or are you just trying to gain social brownie points? Do you want people to think of you in a positive light, as a change agent, as a right fighter? And I also challenge you with the question, is when does your duty of care or your care ethics end? When you submit that final report, when you wrap up that project, is that the end? Do you see yourself as being responsible for the unintended consequences that occur afterward? So after all, if you can't challenge yourself, you're not going to be able to challenge the system. And I will say it again, they were meant to be provocative questions, but it serves a purpose. It moves me on to the next hack. And the best way to hack the systems is to foreground the wisdom of First Nations people. So First Nations peoples, just to the next slide, Alex, thanks. First Nations people are the original systems thinkers. So Indigenous Australians have and continue to survive colonialism, systematic injustice, and the full ecologies of systems around us that have been designed to marginalise, oppress, and suppress. It's all a part of the grander logarithms that comprise the colonial project. So we know that wicked problems are challenging. We know that every problem is unique. Every problem, wicked problem, is connected to others. And we also know that problems are never completely solved. We also know that our We also know that our solutions can create unintended consequences. We may come up with this amazing program, but we also know that as responsible ethical marketers that we have to acknowledge the possibility and the presence of unintended consequences, positive, negative, or perverse. I always like to think of social marketing or draw this sort of comparison to the mythical Hydra dragon with its many heads, where when one is cut off, two will grow back in its place. So how do we stem this? How do we hold back the Hydra dragon of social marketing and social causes and wicked problems? What we do is we use systems thinking. So what is it? So as I mentioned, we often use traditional thinking. So when I shared with you about the English language conventions, for example, or how two-dimensional representations have limited or constrained our ability to communicate, most of the time we use traditional thinking. It's basically Northern Western dominant thinking. It's focusing on straight lines between very simplified models or phenomena or constructs. The idea here is that Western Northern thinking is dominant thinking. It's in our schooling. It's a part of what we do. It's a part of our system. It's how we communicate. But it doesn't allow us to show the full richness of social phenomena and the system. So systems thinking is where we look at this intricate interplay between factors with feedback loops. And as we saw with Christine's presentation, there's amazing ways that we can try to present this, but still in two-dimensional forms. Systems thinking is actually First Nations thinking, knowing, and being. It's the way we are in the world. And in case you're wondering, how is it that we use traditional thinking when actually systems thinking is going to be the way towards transformation? And that's because there's been the systematic destruction of First Nations knowledges, epistemologies, and pedagogies over millennia, over hundreds of years. So with systems thinking, there are a number of characteristics. These systems tools look familiar to Indigenous people because they always have and always will be a part of First Nations people's thinking, knowing, and being. So with these tools as a systems thinker, we should look at the world, or encouraged to look at the world, holistically as wholes, rather than dissect it down into parts with nice, neat, straight lines and unidimensional arrows between them. We should also start to think about these non-linear relationships and be comfortable with complexity and comfortable with communicating complexity. Also, we need to synthesize our understanding to look at things in context and the interplay that they have with other elements around them, other factors that are part of them. We should consider the bigger process. This is a bit like, I always think of this like with a camera, you zoom in and you zoom out. So this idea of looking at these bigger processes is pulling back and understanding where people are in their life course, which has created the context, which has created the issue or the behavior that you're focusing on. We also have to look at this idea that our interventions themselves are a process. Just as people's, and as a result of that, people move through steps and stages, or however you wish to define it, but they move through a process of change. Networks, of course, are critical, and it's important to look at the interconnectivity or view social phenomena in terms of its connectedness, not its separateness. Now, these things are difficult, and the reason they're difficult is that we have traditional thinking as a part and enshrined in our education systems. So systems thinking means that we must take a different perspective. And this, of course, we can draw from our First Nations peoples who have survived the colonial project and thrive. Next one. So I'll leave you with a little bit of a script that I saw in the movie Goldstone. I thought this was really poignant. The system was not made for you. You were made for the system. I'd love to hear in the chat what you think about that quote and what it means to you. So thank you for your time. And I hope those provocative questions have sparked growth, have sparked thought, and that we can move forward. So thank you. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Maria. That was a very insightful presentation on systems. Also, everyone, we are having a Q&A session towards the end. So if you are having any questions that you would like asked, please put into the chat box below, and we'll ask those towards the end in a 15 to 10 minute Q&A session. And now I'm introducing Sharyn, who's going to talk about the practical side of systems. Over to you, Sharyn.
Thanks, Alex. So I realised very quickly and early on, and Maria, thank you for the provocation, because I think it is something each and every one of us needs to actually face. I was bracketed, I was trained, it was linear thinking, and I had my own set and my world experience to bring to the fore. And because I thought that maybe when I joined academia, maybe taking my talent in marketing and bringing it out for social gain or environmental gain, instead of teaching big corporations how to make even more money and potentially further widen gaps, I came in with a beautiful naivety, thinking I could actually be a bit of an angel and maybe I could change the world. And it's worth actually stopping for a moment to really reflect and think, because I am part of the problem. Every time I walk in and raise someone's hope and walk away when the funding ends, I leave people hurt. I leave them harmed, and they have no ability to come forward out of the space they have. Worse still, every time we leave these people untouched and we're not achieving the outcomes they need to see, we actually force them to close down, to shut down, to stop trusting that perhaps the work that we do and other people around us who believe they're doing well, we really are doing a whole lot of harm. So to come forward and to actually start to question and challenge, how is it that we're going to bring about change? We have got to challenge the status quo, because business as usual isn't enough and we're failing to close the gap. So unless we get real and we start to measure what we do and move forward in breaking the system apart and getting to a new normal, we haven't done enough. So let me start forward with how we actually started our behavioural change practice. Let's bring in our marketing thinking and our usual way of actually doing things. Let's actually do some splat campaigns, because of course most of our funders actually want us to actually bring about some change by communicating to an individual that their behaviour needs to change. And one of the real problems with any approach that actually targets an individual is that we can actually create reactants in our communities. We can leave people with an ability to walk away, to turn off, to tune out. And this is not the approach that we want to actually do. So some of our very early work is what I would call very traditional interventionist marketing. Let's come in, listen, learn, build a campaign, and enact some change as we go forward. So take a look at the marketer and what they actually do. Not only do we actually bring in posters and leaflets and things, we actually also know through our marketing training that if we literally change the environment surrounding people, so in this case with Go Food, if we make the healthy choice the easy choice, if we make it prominent, upfront, you think about how chocolate bars are always at the supermarket checkout. Marketers have known for a very long time, if we place it at a point that's really easy, we will move the product. We will catch you at your weakest moment. So we can bring about change without even appealing to rational man. We can actually make it so easy that they actually want to go forward and actually do it. Next slide. So if you take a look at this campaign, and here on the side, you can actually see some of the posters, leaflets and things, where we knew that military personnel, if they're motivated, can actually make healthy food choices, and we can actually measure that choice by actually using a traffic light system. We can actually change behaviour and actually get people to choose the healthy alternative. So take a look here at how through environmental change, but also posters and leaflets and things. So Christine, sometimes these things do work. We can actually make the healthy choice the right choice. But early on in my work, I became pretty frustrated pretty quick. You see, the funding comes and goes. So program comes in, we demonstrate change. Maybe the change isn't fast enough, because a lot of our funders want a silver bullet. They want the program to fix everything all at once. But is that realistic? Because my early commercial training celebrated growth. That meant we'd beaten competition, we'd taken away market share, and we were moving forward. In the social and behavioural change space, it's one step even harder, because I'm actually getting people to swap to an entirely different behaviour. So as we stepped forward and started to consider the food environment and what surrounds the individual, I personally became very challenged, so heavily realising the work that we were doing is part of the problem if we continue to pursue an individual. Because some individuals have significantly less opportunity to actually enact the change that we are asking of them if we put out some nice shiny posters, leaflets and things. So we really have to think about this. And pictured here is food environment mapping work from Queensland. So here, surrounding me, demonstrating that some of the suburbs that are just within literally 5 to 10 minutes drive from me, there are people who have very little opportunity to get any healthy food at all. So unless we can fix the environment surrounding the people, how can we expect them to bring about the change that we think we need them to actually see? So this is where I move forward. And I have to thank Christine Domigan and her team for sharing with our team very early on the work that she was undertaking in the space of systems and social marketing. Because as a marketer, I've been trained to win. I've been trained to create solutions that are compelling, that deliver the exchange environments that bring operators together. And by bringing people together, we can actually start to assist in facilitating a new business as usual model. Because that's what it takes. It takes busting apart where we currently are and doing something different. So what we call the triple win, because this isn't just about bringing two parties together. This is about bringing together multifactorial response that we actually need to see to enact social change. So if you look at the words of Albert Einstein, he very clearly reminds us that we will not get different solutions if we approach it in the same way that we have in the past. Now, this is really difficult when I'm working with people. I've come to learn so quickly and so early that we tend to go to the people we know. We trust the things we've done before. We talk in a language we're familiar and comfortable with. And the more you bust outside of your own silo or break out of those brackets, the more you start to realize that there are some commonalities across us all. But there are incredible differences in understanding or how we approach and think and talk and do something. And unless we can really start to work through other people, not by just merely trying to understand them and create something that they want, but to actually start having those conversations and building the relationships and creating the trust to actually do it differently, from then we can actually move away from what we actually know. So systems thinking really requires a departure from what we did. So for me, who really was trained, do A, get B, I had to go to Ireland and learn with Christine and her team and start to bust apart what I knew. And I have to say, this has very much changed me as a practitioner and how I operate, because it is about understanding how we bring more people together. And for me, rather than thinking program or intervention, it's like what areas are out there and strengths and things that we can actually build on because they already exist. And sometimes they're not getting enough voice. And how can we help bring their voices to the table and actually help get the change that everybody knows that we actually need to see? So systems thinking has all sorts of different mindsets that need to be adopted to try and help people to understand what else it is that we can actually do. So for those who've been trained in a certain way, it's probably time to turn that off and to actually expose yourself, walk into other worlds and start to really try and bust out of what you've currently been doing. So systems thinking has different habits, and these are things that as a personal practitioner, I've had to really increasingly work on myself to figure out what am I going to do next to actually start to move forward and challenge the status quo. So at the start of 2020, long before COVID ever hit, my family decided we were going to try and have a year of being plastic free. Now that's incredibly difficult in a world where everything that we buy, or traditionally, certainly I had in supermarkets, my food was actually packaged in plastic. So we went on a journey and we started shopping at markets and finding the places and spaces where potentially our family could actually try and start to make a difference. Because if enough of us take it on and try and actually get against the status quo, we will see market response rapidly as we actually try and move forward. So it's really important to understand what's possible, what's not, long before we ever step out and ask other people what we want to do. So Maria, I would like to tell you, it is nice to actually sit there and say, what is it that I'm going to try to do this year so that I can understand a little bit more about maybe how we can actually bring about some behavioural change. So moving forward, how do we do this? Because systems is something people speak about a lot. Or if we take a perspective and we say macro and we use and we talk really big, it has to be about more than just convincing a policymaker to actually enact a change. Because even if I can convince policymakers to set the change, that does not mean a population is simply going to follow the new rule that has been set. And COVID reminds us of that every single day. So don't be looking for the panacea and the magic bullet that's just going to fix it with one thing. Change is difficult and humans tend to resist change. We're habitual. We love to revert to what we know. So you have to understand every time you are pushing for a bit of change, it is confronting for the other people you're working with. And no, we don't want to leave unintended consequences and people in the lurch. So how do we start? Where can we go and what can we do? Sometimes we need to actually break this all down. Christine spoke tonight about provisioning systems, the different types of systems. One of our participants, Mary, struggled a little bit to say, well, which system am I working within? And the answer might not be to go and type yourself into one box, but to at least start to break it down and to start somewhere. Because if we don't, how else are we going to actually make progress and start to move forward? So pictured on screen is one example of getting in, rolling sleeves up, talking to stakeholders, asking them who else to speak to, and continuing that process until you start to hear a pattern and getting some consistency. So we call this a bounded system or a system of interest, but at least it allows us, with not as pretty a map as Christine's team had drawn, but to start to look at the causal loops, the actions, the interactions between players to find the leverage points. By learning, we can start to see who is open to what and where that point might be for first entry to move most people forward fast enough. So behavioural change is a really complex space. Take it out into a system setting and it gets a whole lot worse. So I have often come to view this as a spider's web. It's intricate, it's woven together, and it moves over time. The wind makes it get rebuilt, different things happen, and it just continues to get built, and it holds, and it exists, and it continues to be. So don't try and think of this as trying to create the A to the B to the C and which way the loops actually go, but just realise that there are 2 degrees of separation and every player in this system is interconnected in some way. And in fact, the relationships between them are so close that the first moment something happens, there is a reaction. So it's not just about the actions, it's about the reactions, the interactions, and all of the dynamics that are going on in that space. Systems are ever changing. They are moving all the time. So how do we get inside a system and start to work to understand what it is that we can do? I won't go into huge detail tonight, but what I will do is show you that it is possible. So in the space where pesticides can get into the waterway and that waterway can trickle out to damage the Great Barrier Reef, it is possible to bring about systems change. And this is a way that we can actually do it. By bringing together systems approaches and working to identify stakeholders, and the important part here is not just the usual suspects, using different types of methodologies, mapping for stakeholders to ensure you have different players in the room. So if your usual suspects have talked to each other for years, they are but a very small subset of who actually needs to be in this conversation, because you actually need all of these other players here too. So really important to actually ensure that you're working across different groups. So if you're working on pesticides, that means you don't only need the governments and the bodies who are sponsoring the work, the growers who put the pesticides onto their farms, and the industries who support them in terms of giving advice, provisioning for change, so agronomists, extension services. You also need the scientists and the experts in the room. And then really importantly, you actually need the people who sell the chemicals in the first place. And then you need other industries who are aligned and close to that industry, the media, the people who are talking about it. You need them in a room together to actually tackle this problem to see where you can actually go next. So this example was set around barriers. It was a run toward the end of a 3-year project. Why hadn't we received the change that we wanted to see? We asked our diverse stakeholders, after bringing together an expert group, working to map and find all of these different players, and to get their views of what they actually saw. And I can tell you, it can become a bit of a finger-pointing exercise, in that one stakeholder says it's you or you. And that is really interesting when you start to actually look at the comments and the way people see the world. One of my researchers, when we had this all laid out and we were organising for the workshop, asked a question. And I thought maybe it's the most poignant one of all. The question was, do these people talk to each other? And the answer would have been, prior to this workshop, no. So by bringing people together, showing them what other people think, and here you can see pictured on the wall, all of the comments verbatim, so the exact same way that someone's worded it, mistake, grammatical language, the whole lot and all, put up onto the wall. Everybody got to see what everybody else thought. And then they start to step through a process. They have to actually narrow this down to start to make sense, to say what are the barriers, what is preventing change, but importantly, what can we actually do about it? So we used stickers and ran them through 2 rounds of voting to actually get down to the key points. 12 different barriers started to get investigated and interrogated against each other. Does barrier A worsen barrier B? And you can see here, lack of knowledge of product. Does this worsen my confidence to monitor and evaluate for effectiveness? Our team here, and you can see the stakeholders in the room, along with the team at the back, just measuring for the action map, actually went through 45 rounds of this to actually get to this action map. And so here, none of these are more or less important than each other, but if you can fix the one on that with the arrow pointing to it, the lack of product knowledge. So this is what people knew about chemicals, how much to put on, when, at what point in time, and what other practices around it. You could make dealing with everything else a whole lot easier. And there was one barrier here not pictured at all. There was also something else that farmers can do, and that is that they can put in a trap. They can actually dig a really big hole in the ground, water can run into it, and it actually holds the pesticides. It's called a sediment trap. So ways and different ways that we could do it. But why everything else here mapped together? These are all human elements. So when Christine said to you before, both structure and behaviour are important, take a look at what happens when you interrogate all of those together. Structure drops away. Slightly different thing to actually deal with in the change mix. So once you've got your action map, you can actually start to move forward. You can actually get people together to say, what are we going to do about it? And here we have design thinking techniques, and we take the mood in the room from one of hostility, anger, and raw emotion to how and what is it that we're going to do to overcome those key 12 barriers that were actually identified. So let's co-design solutions with people. And here you can see pictured a design thinking method where you actually give people 2 different sticky notes, get them walking around the room to see what other ideas people have. We can then deliberately construct groups and put these groups together to design a solution. So what we did here was ensure we had government, a chemical seller, the support industry and farmers themselves together to actually go through it. Can we generate our solution? And one of my favourite pictures on the screen shows a map and a stream and how they actually designated the different types of initiatives that could happen, demonstrating how government could put in supportive actions, industry itself, and then right down to every individual stakeholder involved. And one of the things that jumped out so quick in that room was we need to start talking more. So not only do we do it from a negative stance, and not only can we do it in a room, this year with COVID, our team had to learn how to go online. So let's work with stakeholders this time to set priorities. Where are the areas of action that we should actually settle in on first? This time, the context are 2 fish species here in the Queensland waterways, pearl perch and snapper. Both are getting overfished. So if we can actually protect these fish by moving attention elsewhere or coming up with strategies that people are happy with, maybe it gives them enough time to regrow in stock, to breed, have their babies, and actually start to replenish themselves in our waterways. Now, going online was a fantastic experience. It enabled a few challenges for our team as we had to figure out how to take a process that was run in person, in a room where everybody could see everybody, into a world of, well, we can't be in rooms because we're not allowed to, so how are we going to deal with that? Now here you can see a similar process used. Every individual stakeholder asked, give me your 5. So in the past it was 5 barriers, this time 5 priorities. Now here is where it starts to get interesting for our team. Instead of having a small number of respondents, suddenly the numbers explode. We had 239 stakeholders who replied to our work. 923 priorities were supplied to our team. So a huge challenge. How do we cut this data down into a manageable way so that our diverse stakeholders can come together and work to actually bring that about? So it did take all of the stakeholders involved considerable hours. There would have been 3 to 4 hours of commitment time from individuals, depending on how fast they read and what they actually do. The consensus process narrowed those 923 priorities down to 13 key areas. And a clear point of interest from a behavioural change team's point of view, many of these were actually identified as policy initiatives. So could we ensure that more policy, including extra policing to ensure that people are adhering to policy, be enacted? So our team focused on the short term. What can we change now? So we moved our speakers, our stakeholders in the session, once again, through a co-design process. Let's come together, work on the initiatives that we know we can actually start to run from now. And this project, being conducted in partnership with Curry Communications with our team, is working in field now. So we're moving towards running the first pilot work next year, and it's working in partnership with Queensland Government. So this is just one example here of one of the facilitated groups and the outcomes that derived from that discussion. We also asked participants, because for us, online was a very first time experience, and we did want, as marketers, to get a bit of feedback to figure out how we actually go forward. And similar to our in-room conversations, stakeholders from diverse backgrounds really do enjoy coming together to actually have a conversation. Sometimes the language, the conversations they're having could do with a bit more time. And frankly, the longer you can give a process like this, the better the outcomes you can actually get. But here is a method and a thing that you can use to put governance in place, to set evaluation frameworks, and to monitor for progress over time. Because change isn't something that happens overnight, and going back and revisiting as we start to see the consequences of our actions also means that processes like this should continue to be run over time. Because as a researcher, it isn't about what I think, and I am not an observer. I am part of that problem. So getting in and understanding how else you can help, who else you can help bring to the table is needed to enact change. And Maria, I think you challenged me tonight, and it has always been one of my permanent challenges. Do you stay in one field, or how can I help bring about and facilitate more change? So for me, it has always been one of trying to figure out what works so I can help others bring it to their practice and start to apply it. Christine, thank you so much for giving our team this capacity to grow and help and try and drive systems change. So thank you all for coming tonight. I know for some in Australia it's getting late, and elsewhere it's different time zones, but thank you ladies for wonderful speeches ahead of me. So back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Sharyn, and also thank you, Maria and Christine. It was a great session on systems thinking. Fantastic, thank you very much. So now we're going to move into the Q&A session with Dr. Joy Parkinson. We've got a couple of questions already lined up, so please, if you've got any questions, can you put that into the chat function, and we will get to them and we'll ask them. We will probably go slightly over time tonight because we have a little bit of an audio issue, but we'll probably finish up in about 10 minutes. All right, over to you, Joy.
Thanks, Alex. Firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you to Christine, Maria and Sharyn. What fantastic presentations. They were all quite different, but also very interconnected and interrelated. And it's certainly something that I've been interested in for a very long time, and really enjoyed all of your presentations. So I'm just going to start with a couple of questions. My first one is to Maria, and I like how you brought in the Indigenous people's approach to systems and just reminded us that they are the original systems thinkers. And this is something that I've been challenged with quite a bit recently. And I was just thinking about how the Indigenous solutions have looked at taking care, not just of individuals, but also the earth. And I think, you know, that's the original systems thinking. And then you were talking about thinking, knowing and being, and that real richness that Indigenous thinking can bring. How do you think we can integrate that into thinking? You know, it's still to many people a really foreign concept. How do you think we can approach that and start to integrate it?
I think probably just that first part being the recognition that there are First Nations peoples who have survived and continue to survive sort of the colonial project and those systems. And look, I don't think it's that easy, Joy. I think that because our whole education system and all of these intersecting systems sort of send us in a certain direction and a certain script in our lives. So you actually have to stop yourself and say, how can I look at this differently? I sort of find it interesting because obviously for me, this type of systems thinking is very natural. And for a long time in my life, I would have these sort of see things that others couldn't. So almost like that movie where that kid could see people that weren't there. And I never actually understood what it was. All I can say is start with looking at the whole rather than the parts. And that really is a part of asking great questions and engaging in a process of deep listening. So there's an Indigenous process called Didari, and that's about deep listening and just stopping and taking in not just the person and the thoughts, but the environment, the pulse, the wind, everything that's happening in that space. And it's when you're in that space of deep listening that you can start to see those insights. So I also think asking great questions. You know, I often say to my own research students about the power of questions. We actually don't teach people how to ask great questions. I showed some of my students the other night some resources on negotiation and that first part of qualifying. So I'd say work on those skills, the fundamentals, listen and ask great questions. The more you get others to speak and talk and the more you observe, the more you'll start to engage in systems thinking.
Thank you. That's really insightful. And I think, that listening and that real deep listening as well, and thinking about the questions that we ask is a great place to start. So thank you. And thank you for your 3 really provocative questions as well. I think that they made us all think really hard about our own practice and what we do as well. Now, my next question is to Christine. And you were talking about the importance of behaviour and structure as well. And you also talked about how structure is essentially socially constructed. So when we have, limited budgets or limited access to policy influence, how can we start to, change the construction of these structures as change agents or just as people?
Gosh, good question, Joy. And I suppose if I look at some of the projects we've been involved with, like the flu one we talked about tonight, you're talking about 6 hospitals on the west coast of Ireland. You're talking about a director of health services, a doctor who was responsible, had been given responsibility for the flu vaccination, but she wasn't on the board of management of the hospital. She wasn't, involved in HR or setting up policies to do with sick leave or anything like that. So what she found, and what you'll find when you look at the behavioral dynamics, the first is to identify the dominant behavioral dynamics that are differentiating the different groups of people, the different networks, and their responses. So that deep listening that Maria is talking to, observing them. I mean, not just talking to them, focus groups, yes, surveys, yes, but that observation, living in their world, walking a mile in their moccasins, as the old Indian saying goes, that starts to clue you into how they feel, how they think. And some of that will be working against the behavior that people want to see in the system. That's that collective good behavior, but some of it will also be behavior that is working for the star that you're looking at. So as a result of understanding those behavioral dynamics, and because of the results that we got, so the flu vaccination rate among nurses went from 8% to 45% in less than 3 years. And I can't credit all of it to the flu mapping work, because there were other things happening in the system. But that naturally drew the policymakers' attention to the work that was being done. So we presented, for example, to the Board of Management, and importantly, picking up on what Maria and Sharyn are saying, what was very important to us was that we didn't just parachute in, do a nice project, get a nice map, and then come out again. It was critical that we empowered the teams that were there to engage in this process themselves, so that we basically did ourselves out of a job. And they are now, the people involved in flu vaccination are training each other. They're doing stakeholder consultations. They are working with different groups. And that then, you know, because this is a process, go back to systems being a process, in time that caught the attention of our national policymakers. And now we're going through a listening and learning process with them. So it doesn't happen overnight. There are days where you think, great, that's a great win. There are other days you come home and you think, oh my God, how come we took 2 steps back? But this is the process. This is communication. This is relationships. So sticking with it, bearing with it, but adopting that bigger picture insight that both Maria and Sharyn are talking about, and understanding your role and part in it, and trusting a little bit too, is part of the answer.
Thank you. That was a fantastic answer. Yeah, and I think just starting to, you know, the listening and observing and embedding ourselves in these, you know, in the communities or the issue that we're trying to change, to really understand, you know, what are the complexities that people are facing, and that lived experience as well is really important. So thank you so much. So we have a couple of other questions. So Joe Williams has asked, how can one assess how place sensitive a problem is? That is, if working in a chronic disease, how do we decide at what geographic scale to do the mapping? So I'm not sure. Christine, is that a question that you may be best? Yeah,
there's no right or wrong answer here. And you'll have already picked up from Maria and Sharyn, you know, where do you stop? You know, do you take a system like we did, and we stopped with the West of Ireland because that was the budget, that was the existing structure that we had, and that was part of the remit? Or do you go larger and look at a national system or an international system? So no matter where you draw the boundaries, like Maria is saying, these are people putting boundaries on living ecosystems. So these are, you know, man-made, women-made boundaries. So you need to be conscious of that. But you've also got to cut your cloth, so to speak, to your measure, meaning you've got to be realistic and practical. And that's one of the strengths of social marketing. Social marketing is great behavioral science, but it's also brilliant implementation science. And you will get an action, the processes that you're involved in, and hopefully you will get the reaction, which may bring a ripple effect beyond your current boundaries. But the worst thing you can do is not pick those boundaries, or not at least decide on a system, recognizing it's embedded, because then you're going to suffer this paralysis by analysis, or you're going to fall back into the old way of thinking that's got us into this problem in the first place. And as Sharyn pointed out, you know, Albert Einstein, we need new ways. So start where you can and learn and get into that process, and it will take care of itself.
Thank you, Christine. I hope that that goes some way to answering your question, Jo. It was a really great question, and I think one that probably many of us face at different times as well. And I think it keeps bringing us back to, you know, how do we move forward? And Sharyn certainly touched on this, moving from programs to services that are, or to, you know, to sustainable processes that allow people to actually do this for themselves, as Christine's touched on with the nurses. We have another question as well. What does the panel think about the behaviour of holding and gaining power and the ability to change the system for collective good?
I guess my take on it was a bit with the second topic, was this idea of that the system reveals itself to you. And I think there's a bit of a process, because sometimes we start to see the power structures around us that constrain us, that move us in a certain direction. But sometimes there's that process, if you actually work it through, you see the system and there's a burden in seeing the system. You carry a burden with you. But what actually happens is you actually come to a point somewhere along the way where you go, what can I do about this? And can I do anything about this? So I guess that's what makes sort of the systems and these grander logarithms so powerful, that how do we change power, and how have others tried in the past, and why did they fail, and what can we do different? And I always think there's a sweet spot in the system. There's always a sweet spot where you can be in the system and turn it on itself. And I'll give you a random answer, but this idea of how you can, you know, turn the tax system against itself so that you can get more benefits. I think within any system, there's a weakness, there's an Achilles heel, but you have to get into it first in order to find the soft spot. So a part of this is, I don't think there's ever going to be a straight answer about how we shift power and privilege, but the first thing we can do is acknowledge it. So that's why that unbracketing is important, because then we can all start to see how our own stories, how our lives and life course has brought us to a particular program or a particular phenomena at that point in time. I don't have an answer for you, but probably just that sense that sometimes when we see the system, we can't unsee it, but it creates that burden or that frustration, because then we realize we can't necessarily change it in great ways.
Thank you, Maria. And we have another quick question there as well. And perhaps, Sharyn, I might direct this one at you, and it's probably one that I have a lot of opinions on as well, is how do we manage the tensions with stakeholders? And, you know, we've talked a lot tonight about networks of stakeholders, and, you know, potentially they come from different perspectives, they have different goals and challenges, different priorities as well. How can we overcome some of those tensions?
I think one of the best ways when we first start engaging with stakeholders, so if there's ever a new scenario, it is to start with that simple, what's in this for me? So with every stakeholder sitting around a table, for example, in the old face-to-face world, having them sit there and explain their reason why they're there, and then to start to step forward. And wherever possible, rather than broad, free-ranging conversations, very focused on one issue where everyone's responding to the same question and challenge at most points, is going to be the best path forward. People do need to get better at transparency, so communication is key, and trying to manage the complexity of that, because essentially what happens across that constellation or spider's web of stakeholders is that when they don't like something, the whole system will push back against the change that's trying to chip through. And it takes the groundswell to emerge before the change is going to start to actually be seen. So it does take persistence to actually push through, because sometimes it's like Christine, I think, was the one that said, you can take one step forward and 2 steps back. So it is a process, and that has to be acknowledged, that it's not fast. But if someone's very true and sticking to their guns, it will come. Yeah,
thank you. I think that was really quite insightful. And, you know, I know that some of the work that you've done, you have worked with a very broad range of stakeholders who certainly, yeah, have come from different perspectives. And I think just highlighting that need for transparency, that persistence as well, the clear and open communications, and I think frequent communications as well between those groups, so that they, you know, can come along on that same journey. And they may never have a true meeting of the minds, but at least if there's open and transparent communications, at least they know where they stand in that, I think, which is really helpful. So thanks for that. That was fantastic. That's all the questions that I have. So I just want to say thank you to the speakers. Thank you to Alex, and I'll just pass back to Alex now.
Thanks, Joy. Again, massive thank you to Christine, Maria and Sharyn. It was a great presentation. I just want to let everyone know that we have 2 more change events happening this year. We're on the 17th of November, on a Tuesday, we're having Save Our Planet and Making Change Happen. And on Thursday, the 3rd of December, we're going to have a seminar on how to build a following for change as well. Now, you probably noticed that there's a little grayed out box just to the left of your screen. That's the previous session. So the previous session we did, you can actually view that now on our website, and as of tomorrow you'll be able to view this session again on our website as well and on YouTube. Also, social marketing Griffith, we have a lot of masterclasses. We have change, but we also have a lot of masterclasses, so please check out our calendar. We have a lot of interesting topics and sessions and webinars that you can all join. And I just want a big thank you for everyone to coming, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. See ya. Bye.